Hi, my name is Eric Kwakkel from the University of British Columbia, and today I'll talk about medieval handwriting, the shape of letters, and how we can read the age of a manuscript in the formation of medieval letter forms.
So, good evening and welcome to the 6th in this Darwin College lecture series on enigmas. Now, many of you know I'm a geophysicist. I still have some reels of magnetic tape, wide, high-tech stuff, seismic records, except these were high-tech in the 70s and 80s. Nowadays, almost no one can read them, and the tape is collapsing. It will likely break into fragments, even if I were to have a tape deck to run it on. So books aren't like that, they can last. I don't know if you've noticed, a few years ago, everything was about Kindle and other similar electronic readers. But now, if you look at people on the trains, paperbacks are back. Today, we're looking at the enigma of medieval books. So there were two Cambridge twin sisters, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. They were Victorian, basically book detectives, who traveled all over the Middle East. And in their travels, they found a mysterious trove of discarded Hebrew manuscripts in Cairo's Ben Ezra synagogue. The results of that investigation, that enigma, are now one of Cambridge's great treasures. In Sinai, they looked at a fascinating 8th century book on female saints, including I really can't say her name, Euphrosyne, I hope I've got that right, who ran away from an arranged marriage to become a male monk. It was an enigma, not that. One book written over another. Hidden beneath the book, they found, there was a 4th century copy of the Gospels in Syriac, the language of ancient Nazareth. Staying in Cambridge, Agnes's husband was the librarian of Corpus Christi College, the Parker Library, where St. Augustine's Gospels have been housed for centuries. The book came to England with St. Augustine in the late 6th century, and so in a sense is England's founding book. After 1400 years, it's still clear, it's still speaking. It's a far, far cry from my disintegrating computer tapes. How does it have that power? Books can keep their mysteries. I think one copy of Diophantus' 3rd century book, Arithmetica, has a marginal note written over 1,000 years later. That note says the proof is too large to fit in the margin. That enigma puzzled people for centuries before Andrew Wiles solved it. And you probably know that was Fermat's last theorem. But tonight we're really back in medieval books. What information is there beside the words themselves? Are there multiple hidden meanings? What types of codes are there to be deciphered? So please welcome Dr. Eric Kwakkel from the University of British Columbia in Canada, who, as you can see, is going to speak to us on the enigmatic pre-modern book. Eric, welcome. Welcome.
I'm extremely happy to be able to share with you the beauty of these objects. They are surrounding us even today. They're very close by in all sorts of colleges, but we often forget about these beautiful medieval manuscripts. I have an hour to talk about them with you. I've locked the doors, you can't leave. And I will share some of my experience with them. I will at least talk about one enigma, perhaps even more. And the idea is that I'll talk about the hidden meaning in the shape of letters. And so I'm not interested so much in the text. And in fact, I usually tell my students when they come into the classroom for the first time, we're not here to read books. We're here to look at them. Because looking at books actually produces a very different kind of experience, but also a very different kind of data. It tells you something about the maker, about the user, about the individuals, who traveled with the book through time and used it on various pages. So I'm not going to share contents of manuscripts with you. I'm not going to read out loud. I'm going to simply show you the letter forms and the hidden meaning inside the shape of the individual letters. So just to situate you, we're talking, of course, about a medieval manuscript. So pre-modern captures more things, but I'm going to hone in on the handwritten book that was used across Europe before the introduction of the printing press by Gutenberg. And as you can tell from these images, it is a process by which a scribe writes with a pen, and in the other hand, often a penknife to keep the parchment in place, because you can't touch it with your fingers. Otherwise, the fatty bits from your fingers will prevent ink from sticking in the right places. And it's made often, and particularly in the time period that I'm going to take you to, which is the 12th century, it's often produced from parchment, which means processed animal skin. And this image on the right, you can tell that it was a cow at some point. It was frolicking in the meadow, and now it's a Bible in the University Library Leiden. And you can still see the hairs of the cow, so it was a white beast. So that, for me, is a fascinating thing about the manuscript. It has a materiality, it has a experience to share that goes beyond reading, that goes into experiencing, into sensing. Now, this lecture, I'm going to zoom in even more on one specific field in the study of medieval manuscripts, and that is my own field, which is paleography, which is the study of medieval writing, medieval handwriting, and I will address it as script, which is the formal term that we use. I think script is one of the most fascinating parts of the medieval manuscript because it brings you very close to the people who actually produced the book. So the scribe rides, toils over this material. It takes him half a year or more to produce a manuscript, and we now in a library get to open this and actually experience almost the same thing as he did when he closed it so many hundred years ago. So I'd like to show you how paleography, the study of medieval handwriting, script, actually tells a story that is independent from many other aspects of the book that you could want to discover, for example, reading. So the enigma for tonight is that medieval letter forms communicate more than just the words, but they communicate something else, which is how old and where the letters are, where the letters were made and how, at what time period they were produced. So as the scribe is writing, he's not only bringing meaning to the page that can be consumed by the reader, he also sort of embeds, translates into the shape of the letters what moment he's writing at in Europe and where on the map of Europe he precisely does that. He doesn't know himself, the scribe. It's usually a he, so I will describe the scribes as he because we have female scribes, but the majority of what I'm talking about is male. These scribes did not know that they would sort of embed this information into the letter shape, but it's how they were trained, and therefore it's what they did. It's that the expert eye today, when you look at it, can sort of sense when this book was made and where it was made. And to me, that's an enigma. Because after I've had that experience, it's very hard for me to say, oh, it's because of 1, 2, 3 arguments. So it's very hard to substantiate a feeling that you have when you look at a medieval script sample. We can check whether we're right or wrong, but by asking 4 more paleographers to have the same experience, and they will likely come up with the same answer around 1100, perhaps in Italy. But why do we think this? That is very strange. So I'm going to force myself to give an answer to that very peculiar question by moving away from the arts and moving into the domain of science. So I'm going to show you a new method of measuring letter forms, and by which we can also say something about the location and the moment of production, but also make more broader statements about script, medieval script, in more general terms. It starts for me with the physicality. Touching something is crucial. And it starts usually at home. When I start a new kind of research, I go to an online database, I find my manuscript, and I see it for the first time. So when I walk into a library, I already have seen usually the manuscript, and many answers have already been given to questions that I may have. But there's nothing more shocking than to see the book for the first time, if only because when you look on a screen, it doesn't tell you how large the object actually is. Large manuscripts become small, small manuscripts become large. So there's a shock of recognition, and it's a great start to a day. When you know that you have 15 of these manuscripts waiting for you, the first one's coming on the table, it's a true delight to know that you can do this, that this is what you're trained for, but also that you have the privilege to look through these very old media, in a sense. The historian Huizinga, the Dutch historian Huizinga, this shows my Dutch roots, actually talks about the physicality. He talks about touch. He says it is a historical sensation that happens when you touch something that is very old, that for a moment you become one with the object, you become one with the time period in which it was made. And he calls it a momentary drunkenness. So you really feel a different person when you realize, for example, that you realize how old something is. So it's not just that you know how old it is, but that you realize that you do. It's like you're hovering over yourself. It sounds all very romantic and a little bit vague, I agree, which is why we bring the science into this in the second half of the lecture. So when you look at the script, finally, if you opened your page, you're at the start of the book, although that necessarily doesn't have to be the starting point of where you start your exploration. In fact, it's proper to start with the binding, and then you could move immediately to the middle if you're not interested in the text. So if you open a page, the paleographer, the expert of handwriting, will get a sense of information almost instantaneously. I will, for example, sense that something is late 11th century, the top image, or that it's rather from the middle of the 12th century. And this is not something I'm calling from myself or that I'm saying, now tell me how old this thing is. It's something that happens, and it's unstoppable, and it's instantaneous. And this is what, for me, is the magic of medieval script. There is information in there, put there by the scribe, without him or her knowing it, and I get to pull that out just by looking at it. And this is the start of usually an exploration into the location of production as well, because script also beams out where it was made. And you can see, even you can see probably that those two samples you're looking at now are very different. But they're both written in the same script. It's the same family of handwriting. So the difference that you notice is perhaps a little bit because of the different time period. There's a few decades in between. But mostly, the differences that your eyes recognize are there because one scribe was working in southern France, or at least was trained in southern France, and the other one was trained in Germany. So information hidden in letter forms. But I couldn't tell you now what that is, what that precise physicality is that beams out to me, I was made in France, or the previous slide, I'm from the late 11th century. But if I then drill down into it, I might find arguments. This argument-finding mission is not uncommon for studying the medieval manuscript. So we have, for example, other physicalities that are quite firmly tied to a certain date of production, or a certain start date, or a certain date of waning a certain feature. For example, this one. Here we see two scenarios, one from the first half of the 13th century, where the first line of text would be written on top of the first ruled line pulled by the scribe with a pen or pencil on the parchment. So imagine, scribe prepares the quire, the sheets that form a quire, and starts to draw all these lines, and then he needs to write the first line. Where will he place the first line? On top of the first drawn line, or below? This is a difference that is almost very abruptly emerging around 1240, so that things written above top line are before that date, and things written below top line are usually after that date, some exceptions. So here's another observable feature, clearly recognizable, and you put in a database if you want. That all works very nicely. But for script, it's a little bit different. How do I measure a letter? How do I describe, in objective terms, the shape of the S? And how do I describe the difference with this S here in front of me and the other one in the next manuscript, which happens to be from Germany or happens to be from a century before? How do I distinguish the differentness between these two S's to such an extent that I can put it in my database and pull data from it. That's a challenge, and in a sense, a product of the enigma of scribes putting in some of their background into their shape of the letters. Now, paleographers have a beautiful solution for this. We don't try to think about the exact solution, but let's hover over it and come up with a term that more or less covers it. And that is the term aspect. So this is used quite often in a classroom, especially if you don't know the answer. You say, it feels like the 13th century, because that's exactly what it says, this term. It's a formal term that we all use as paleographers, and it's fantastic because it actually expresses what we sense. So it really confirms things that I feel, namely the general impression on the page by a specimen of handwriting at first sight. General impression, this, not that, but somewhat there, and at first sight, which is crucial. So you haven't had time yet to activate your rationale and your senses and say, oh yeah, because it's that strange S that I see there, that is very 14th century. It's at first sight. That means it's a zap. And so this is what I call the zap moment, when that happens, when the lightning bolt strikes and the manuscript tells me the very moment of impact, it is from the second half of the 13th century. And I don't know where it comes from. But at least we have the term aspect to cover the process. So what is it in the script that is making a difference between two presentations of a letter? Let me give you one example. So this is sort of where we start to slowly drill down into the specifics of letter shapes and a methodology to capture the differences. So here we have, in blue, two M's, two letter M's, and the one has what we call a Carolingian presentation. So that's the Caroline minuscule, which is an important early medieval script. And you can see that the first two minims, the simple strokes down, are sort of moving more or less to the left. And the right one is perhaps going to the right, but maybe down, I don't know. But the lower one, M, the second M from the 12th century, is actually flicking to the right, right, right. And this is a consistent feature, a difference between two moments of writing that is observable if you search for it. So the eyes of the paleographer after the moment of impact, after the zap has been received. And usually it's not one zap, usually it's two, one for, this is how old it is. Of course it is late 13th century. And, oh, it's from Germany, I thought so. Why do you think so? I don't know, but I'm almost pretty sure. After that's happened, you start to look for these arguments. But there's no data, there's no litmus test, there is no apparatus next to which you can put all these M's and say, okay, it matches what we have here. So you need to generate that information. And that's what I want to talk to you about in this lecture. It's the crux of what I want to do, is to show that there are, in fact, measurable patterns in the production of letter forms that we can use to date undateable manuscripts. And why I say undateable is that medieval books do not yet have a title page. So the title page comes in the age of print, and so the medieval manuscript just starts. And usually it doesn't even say this is Augustine, because you know as a reader it's Augustine, it's redundant, that information you don't need. You start to just read the first line of Augustine's City of God, and then you have the text that you needed. But it doesn't say when it was made or where it was made. So that's a real problem for paleographers today, because you need to get that information somewhere if you are to pinpoint the location where this particular copy of Augustine was produced. And paleography is often called an auxiliary discipline, so we aid other disciplines, and some colleagues don't like that sort of given. I actually love it very much, because it's a great thing as a discipline to be able to serve other disciplines, also because then you can never be really cut away as a small discipline that we are. But for example, historians who need a date for a certain piece of text, or anything from English studies, French and other modern languages, in the medieval text tradition, you need to know exactly when a certain text was copied. And this is where paleography comes in, and this is where aspect becomes important, but it's also time to try to make a little bit more of a scientific approach. That's what I'm doing. Those minims of the M that I talked about are actually we call them strokes. And a stroke is the result of a trace of the pen. So the pen traces a movement and produces a stroke. In medieval written culture, the pen can more or less only go down. There's a little bit of an angle, but as soon as you go up, and you can imagine this if you have a thick nib and you try to push it up, all sorts of weird things happen. You know, ink goes all over the place. So if you want to make an M, that means you make 3 strokes. And so this is the thing that becomes important, which is to see how an individual letter is built from strokes. And we have a term for that as well, and that's called the act of tracing strokes on the writing surface, and we call that ductus or duct. And we have 2 different types, and I'm going to share them with you. One is basic duct, and it's a complicated description, and I even cut half of it away. But it basically means to produce the letter forms that when you produce them, you can still recognize a certain script in it. So you stay within the confinement of what's possible within executing a certain script, a certain writing family, like we saw Caroline Minuscule, but there's also pre-Gothic and there's textualis, different families. If you stay within the confinements of a script, that's basic duct. But then there's also individual ways in which scribes can more or less vary the individual letter forms a little bit, and we call that personal duct. How can you capture personal duct? How can you even capture basic duct? How do you describe an alphabet written in Caroline Minuscule or in textualis? It's very hard, even today. Try to imagine your own handwriting or that of a friend. You might recognize the handwriting when you see the letter on a chair or on your desk, and you realize that you recognize that this is the letter from your mother or your friend. But you can't really tell what it is. So how do you start dissecting the forms and the shapes to make sense of that piece of writing, if you're so inclined to, if you're a paleographer, or if you need the information for another reason? So there's a certain method which I've been working on that produces quantifiable information out of seemingly unquantifiable sources, such as a letter. And there's various ways in which the letter form can vary. And I'm going to share them with you. And the first one is this. I like simple things. I like things that actually you can just apply immediately, and let's not be too difficult about it. So I see in these 2 variants of the letter V that one approaches from the left and the other one approaches from the right. That is, how is the start of the letter made on the left side of the first minim down or on the right side? And that's measurable, left-right, binary is perfect. And you can put it in a database. Call it left to right, call it variant 1, variant 2, whatever you want, but it's a clear observation that can be shared by other paleographers and that I can explain by somebody over the phone saying, look for this letter form where something starts on the left side of the first minim down. The second is the number. How many strokes are needed to produce a letter? In this case, it's the letter T. In the first scenario, it's 2 strokes, 1 down, 1 to the right. And in the second scenario, you see a third stroke is added, a hairline, as we call it. It's not necessary, but in the 14th century, scribes love to do this. The length is a third variable. You see here the N on the left sits on the line, as drawn by the scribe, whereas the second scenario, the second leg, minim, hovers through the line, doesn't stop. So the length, call it length 1, 2, or say on the line, below the line, any way that you want to report is fine, as long as it's distinctive and clear. This is great stuff to do with students as well, because you can really help them see how something very complicated on the page, the handwriting of an individual that you've never seen, is actually super interesting and easy to dissect if you just have a few tools at your disposal. The last one is the shape of the stroke, and in the first scenario you see, let's call it curvy or non-straight or option 1, and in the second one you see a straight line in the little tongue stroke that comes out of the E. 4 ways to measure how scribes put down one particular stroke in one particular letter. How, for example, different scribes in one period did so, or different scribes in different periods, or different scribes in different countries. the shape of the letter is the same, basic duct. But the individual duct, how you execute that convention, is up to you. Now we have a means to see what it can do for you, how you can measure things, how you can talk about it in quantifiable terms. This is very unlike paleography as we used to do it, as we still do it, and as it works as well, and as I do it every day too. That is the sensing, the aspect part. But let's build something on top that helps us calibrate our system. That makes us think twice about, are we right about this particular date? Yes, I see it confirmed by data, or not. So I see it as a complementary system that can help us paleographers make sense of script. I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper sample from the transition from the top script, Caroline minuscule, to Gothic textualis, which is the lower script. And by doing so, we go right through the period of pre-Gothic script, which is defined as a separate script, but you will see it yourself as well, can be seen as a sort of an earlier stage of Gothic. That is, Caroline minuscule in its purest form stopped. All sorts of things started to change, and it took a long time, and out comes textualis, Gothic textualis. So we're going to measure what happened in that middle script as the top script migrated, morphed into the lower one. So as one does, you build a database, and it's straightforward. I don't like fussy things, so it needs to fit on my laptop. It needs to be easy to use when you sit next to a manuscript. No scrolling, just fill it out. Here are registered all the different presentations of letters of the lower script, textualis, compared to the top script, Caroline. So I looked at our handbooks, and I found all the letter forms that started to do something different in their appearance when they arrived in the Gothic textualis age. And this database, and I'm not going to talk too much in detail about it, but it basically allows you to track what form 33 different letters and pieces of letters have. Is it in the first state, Caroline? Is it in the middle, pre-Gothic? Or is it in Gothic? So it allows us to keep track of something that you can do maybe for one manuscript by heart, but when you look at 200 manuscripts, and I used 353 manuscripts because those were the number of manuscripts in a series of dated and datable manuscripts that I use because they have a colophon in which the scribe says, I, John, wrote this book in Paris in 1312. So 1 in 20 manuscripts, a scribe identifies where and when he produced the book. I took all those cases for this period, stuck them in a database, and started to track the difference in presentation of letter forms. This is a sort of fairly complicated thing and hard to boil down in sort of a 2 to 5 minute in-between thing that I'm doing at the moment. But the only thing to remember here is that this data that I'm going to show you is based on dated materials in which the scribe has said, I live in this period, and sometimes even in this country. And that we're tracking how a script develops through medieval Europe during the various moments that we can measure with the help of these dated manuscripts. This is a sort of graph that you can produce. So here are the results of 353 manuscripts times 33 features is about 10,000 observations. And you can see the black line in all the graphs I'm going to show you is the Gothic presentation. That's the new presentation where it will go to. Whereas the red line that you see is Caroline. That's the oldest version of the script where it comes from. So basically, you can see it in this graph as well. Red will be there still in my period and then go down to 0, whereas black, the new way of writing, will come up in a certain speed. And then in between is a mix that I'm not going to talk about, which is scribes basically a few generations of scribes that for one particular letter use different forms, one from the older presentation and one from the newer presentation. So this shows us, objectively, I like to think in a scientific way, except I'm hesitant to do that because it's only 353 manuscripts. But still, where we come from, normally one manuscript and aspect, this is a pretty good step forward. And it shows us, if only via an indication, how, in this case, one particular feature emerges in medieval Europe. And you know this feature because I talked about it. It's the flicking of the feet to the right. And we can do this for other features as well. For example, one of my favorite ones is called biting. This is not my term. It's a paleographical term whereby two letters positioned next to each other are actually overlapping. You can see how one stroke bites into the other stroke. And if you dissect this particular feature into the variants, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ways in which two letter forms with contrary round curves, DE, O, PO, sitting next to each other can start to bite. So it's the round parts that overlap, and not like straight and round, it doesn't overlap, but round. You can see here that it's the first one coming is the PP and the BB, which is my favorite one because it breaks the century in half. So based on PP, you can immediately see I'm in the first or second half of the 12th century, objectively speaking. It's a wonderful little feature. And all the other ones come later in the century. It's particularly interesting because this feature is seen as the ultimate criterion for saying this is Gothic script. It's the most important feature of that new type of script that our handbooks say is established by 1225. And you can see here immediately that by 1225, it's nowhere near 100%. So you can see also, and this is basically, I'm building on the work of my predecessors. I can only do this because people before me have done the groundwork. I realize that. But I think it pushes us a little bit forward because it enables us to say maybe the boundaries between the various scripts are not here but there. Maybe it was actually finished a little bit later. That's from this graph alone. You can also see from individual strokes how a larger movement takes place in script, a larger occurrence of a change. And here's one example. If you look at the stage before biting, and I've dubbed this kissing, that's my term, because you can see it's not overlapping yet, but it's not separate either. It's starting to hesitatingly kiss before it starts to overlap. So if you put that in your data, you can see, and that's your red line, writing things separately, DE, is going down quickly. First, in green, the kissing starts. Things start to come together. And then, 30 years later, biting starts to emerge in Europe. And this is wonderful, and you know, this is great to look at script like this. It's very pedagogically correct, I think, to use these terms. I love talking about manuscripts in just what it is, make something up, as long as it works for us. Here, you can see that there is a movement called lateral compression. That is, there was such a need for more space on the page that scribes started to position the letters closer and closer together. And you can almost see that the letters are trying to avoid each other, and then no longer can this happen, and therefore kissing happens. And then they start to go even closer, and then there's overlap, and that's biting. So I've compared it to 3 people sitting on a 2-person's couch versus 2 people sitting on a 3-person's couch. So you're very wide, lots of space, or you're forced when you watch this movie, you don't want to touch your neighbor, but you have to. So this is a movement that's broader. It goes throughout the script of the 12th century as a whole, and it goes beyond just the one feature. There's the same with other features, for example, the flattening of round parts. Yeah, I should have it said actually in my notes, but I left my notes on my left hand here. It said, give them a warning that this is going to be a strange graph. Well, I love this graph because this shows you how pre-Gothic script, how the movement from Caroline to Textualis actually takes place. You would think, and I thought for a long time, when a new script emerges, first there is 5 scribes that do it, who write that new script in the perfect form. And then there's 10, and there's 20, there's 100, there's 1,000, and this is how the new script goes over Europe. You can see here that's not true. This shows you 150 years of features trying to find a certain position in the script. So you can see that one feature is introduced when they come from 0, and is taking off and might actually become popular or die off. So you can see how a medieval script is not born in perfection, introduced and used in perfection by a growing number of scribes. This particular script, pre-Gothic, is actually formed as it is being used. And this explains why you have so many differences in 12th century scripts. both in time, first quarter, last quarter, 12th century, and in space. Why French scribes write so very different from English scribes, for example. Because they are just different features that are important to those particular scribes. The other thing, you've seen this graph before, the other thing it shows, this data, is how long it takes for a feature to emerge, and also that within the period of observation, it might not hit 100%. So we're hovering here at the end around 80. And here you can see on the same data how in some countries, some features stick quicker than in other countries. So here we have all the results of all the new features generated per country. And so the black line is Europe as a whole, but you can see that France and England are actually advanced in the use of all the Gothic features together. So this is the 33 features that I'm tracking in my database together, versus another region, Germanic, so that's the Low Countries, nowadays Belgium, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, are actually much more hesitant to do so. Different adaptation of a new way of writing a particular letter produces different ways of writing the same script, as you can see here, and it produces different ways of writing in different countries. And that is something that we learn when you put data in a database. That is how aspect is sort of the first step that you do, but then let's try to make a more scientific thing out of it and see how that feeling that we have can be complemented by data. There's one other thing that I'd like to show you, which is this. Here we see how Germany actually is totally flat. So that's the Germanic countries is the blue line that you can hardly see. So this is the case of a feature that is not used in a certain domain, a certain region of Europe at all. Which is also interesting because it's not something that you think of, that a certain feature is not used by not a single scribe, in this case in the Germanic region. I'd like to take you to another place, and I'd like to talk about a different scenario. The scenario I now talked about is how a script progresses naturally, how it develops in a natural circumstances. 150 years, people across Europe do all sorts of different things, and it ends up in one particular way of writing, one form that is measurably the same, which is Gothic textualis, which is the third script that I showed you at the bottom of the three. There's also a different scenario, which is where a script gets sort of introduced in a non-natural way. That is to say, a natural progression is stopped, and a new way of writing is forced upon a group of scribes in a scriptorium. And that is what happens in this place, which is Rochester. Rochester Cathedral Priory in the late 11th century is, of course, a predominantly Norman house. There are 5 English canons which are removed in 1083, and Gundulf of Bec, who has established a community there, brings in 60 Norman scribes in the wake of the conquest. The community starts to flourish, there's a new library built, there's a new scriptorium built, and there's a high production of books. And these books in the 11th century look like this. It's a Norman hand. I saw one today even from Rochester in Trinity College. It looks exactly like this. And this is what it looks like in Normandy, and the Normans being transported to Rochester keep on writing in their continental manner, maybe renewing their way of writing in the ways that we saw in the various colored lines that I showed you. But then something weird happens. And this is around 1100. Something changes, so that by the end of the first quarter of the 12th century, everybody writes in a very different way, and it looks like this. So this is what's called the prickly script. It's Neil Kerr's term. It's a wonderful term because if you would 3D print this letter and you would put your hand on top, it actually hurts your hand. It's prickly. I think it's a brilliant term. But it shows you here what's actually measurable in the way that we've looked at things. So the blue circles show you how a shape changes, namely the round, perfectly round curved back of CEO actually becomes sort of pointy. So it's made pointy. The red one shows how there's pronounced feet coming up. So a sharp turn is added. There's a change in direction. And the green ones, so that was the red one. Sorry, the green one, the serifs are added, which is in the F and the P and the S. There's an extra stroke added so that the letter has a more robust appearance. So this is how, oddly enough, all scribes write by 1125 in Rochester. The background of these scribes, their Norman origins, are subdued, have disappeared. You can hardly see the difference between one and the other. And it's really remarkable to see a group of people in one place being able to write so much the same that the paleographer today is unable to express how one is different from the other. I can see they're not the same. And in fact, you can give them names, which I will show you in a moment. You can say scribe 1, 2, 3. And I know how one scribe has certain things that are sort of beam out a certain feeling. But it's hard to capture the differences. If you throw these sort of Norman hands with their suppressed Norman script, with their newly created script, which was imported from Canterbury, and we know probably who did it as well, because there's one particularly early manuscript from 1107 that has an early form of this. When you put this in a database, something wonderful happens. It enables you to measure how much the same these hands are. And here's just a sample of 11 manuscripts. And I've put the names in there, so sort of not their real names, of course, although in some cases there are real names. But it shows you in the last column how Gothic these hands are. That is to say, I'm just asking the software to return how much percent of the 100% Gothic features that scribes could use. That is, the 100% of Gothic features that we paleographers said, these are all the Gothic features. How much percent of that 100% each scribe does. And the remarkable thing is that a few cases aside, it all hovers between 42 and 46%. And that explains why, when you look at the script, it expresses similarity. It expresses, yes, I can tell it's not the same, but I can't tell why they're different or how they're different. That's returned by data. And that's really wonderful, because it also allows you to do it the other way around, throw a whole bunch of manuscripts that you haven't looked at yet into a database and see which ones are potentially from the same scriptorium based on the return of certain percentages. So there's a whole lot of things you can do if you start to quantify and measure letter forms rather than saying the aspect is late 12th century. In Rochester, there's one interesting case that I want to share with you, which is, yes, all these Norman hands, their script is suppressed. They now write in fact, an English manner, because it's a script that was built on Norman origins, but it's very much an invention of Canterbury and a few people there. So it's an English product that is now in the second generation of invaders are now writing a proper English script. But there's still, of course, the Norman roots of all these hands. And even more so, these hands, these people, came from Bec, most of them, which is an abbey in Normandy. And these people in Bec came from other places. And we know this from the various annals and from the various historical texts that say the school in Bec was visited by people from Germany, from Italy, from the Low Countries. And the people were persuaded to stay and become a member of the community. We have this in writing. So the people in Bec wrote ultimately in a Norman way, but were trained in their age as a novice when they first came into the monasteries in England, in Italy, Low Countries, Germany. When that happened, they were trained in the Italian, German, Low Countries way. Then they went to Bec and were forced to write in the Norman way, or forced, at least invited, perhaps. And then they were sent to England, to Rochester, and there they had to adopt the prickly script. The only place where you can still see the very origins of the very first moment when they started to write is when they do pen trials. So the scribe had to cut the nib of the pen every so many pages, and to see if the nib had the same width as the letters that he just wrote down, you needed to test it somewhere. And so there was a sheet of paper, a parchment, next to the scribe, and he would doodle on it, he would write his name, he would say, I'm trying my pen. And in this case, he would even write the oldest Dutch literature that we have, which is in the central column, which is Hebben alla vogela nestas, hinaze hic en dadu, wat umbidan benu. All birds have nests except you and I. What are we waiting for? That's the oldest Dutch in existence. These pen trials, if you look at them more carefully, now that we know what Italian script and German script and Low Country script looks like, measurably so in a database, we can actually see the origins of these people. They're testing their pens in the way they were learned, they were taught to write in Italy, in the Low Countries, and in Germany. So these are people that are writing in the prickly script. It's the same quarter century in which the prickly script becomes the normal script, the norm in Rochester, Canterbury, Rochester and Canterbury, but we're talking about Rochester. But at the same time, they needed to test their pen, and when they move away from their formal writing and they scribble, and they put something down, it doesn't matter, that will be thrown out or recycled as a flyleaf, they revert to their default position. And through that, they show you where they're really from, who they really are, and then when they turn back to their writing, they become English again, or at least a Roger Monk writing in the style. That solves, I think, one enigma. That is, it's the difference between the stroke application, the stroke configuration, that produces a different image that is uploaded to our brain as paleographers, and that makes us say this is early 15th century or early 14th century, or that makes us say this is Germany, or a third variant that I didn't talk about and I shan't either. This is a scribe that I've seen before, which is an entirely different sensation to sit in a library and know that you've seen this scribe, and that usually, for me, it's in the shower, I get the sense, oh yes, that was in Vienna, of course it's that manuscript. The same sensation helps you to make sense of scriptoria, of how scribes are connected to each other, how books are connected to each other. That, of course, is all produced by the letter forms beamed out to the eyes. And since ductus, how strokes are put down on parchment, is the only thing that we observe with our eyes, it must be so that these letter forms are what produces that particular sensation of time, space, and sometimes recognition of a hand. There's a little PS enigma that I want to tag on to this, which is, how does it work? Actually, how do you make a letter form travel from A to B? I mean, it's all very nice what I talked about, but how do you actually imagine that a new way of writing becomes adopted by somebody else? Okay, somebody sitting next to you in the scriptorium, I can imagine. You look over, that's a really nice G. I'm going to do that too. So there you go. But what about, say, the aspect? How do you bring a whole alphabet in line with somebody next to you? That's difficult. But what about the next monastery? What about the whole of Europe? You've seen the lines go up. And as the black line reached 100% means all the scribes in the corpus, representative for scribes in Europe, are doing this new feature. That means that it's not just the neighbor that has to be inspired and maybe taught how to do this beautiful G, but also scribes one monastery over, 2 countries over. How does that work? Well, this is an enigma that I can only touch on because I'm almost through my time. But I want to share my thoughts on it. And I think if you think logically about this, it must be in the training that this happens. And in fact, if you look at how scribes were trained, and here we have Orderic Vitalis, a very famous historian, late 11th century, early 12th century, who was cantor and a librarian in a French abbey. Here you see him prompt a pupil. So the first lines are written by Orderic, and then he stops, and then he says to the pupil, and now you continue. This prompting is a normal thing in the training of scribes, and you can see if I were to blow this up, and you could see for yourself how the second scribe, the pupil, is actually very much like Orderic Vitalis. You can tell them apart, but you can also see that they're very similar. So Orderic is giving his own way of writing to the pupil. So if Orderic would decide, I'm going to do things completely different, I've seen this beautiful G when I was in this other monastery, I'm going to embed that in my writing so that I can pass it on to my pupil. Then you can see how slowly something becomes a norm in more places than one. And this is how I think a new way of writing disseminates through Europe, through training. Here's another example. This was a pupil who sort of did not do so well. So he's prompted by the teacher, and then there's a switch, and then the teacher pushes him aside again. No, that's not how you do it. Here, I told you like this, and then so it goes back and forth a few pages. So it's really a rigid way of learning how to write. The teacher really wants to see something. It's not just about writing legibly. It's about writing in the style of the teacher. And in fact, we have this from Anglo-Saxon manuscripts as well, where it says in the top margin, this is how you write. So it's a model. It's an almost dogmatic way of putting your pen on the parchment in a certain way. Now, I wish I could say this is how a script moves forward from being a little bit novel to very novel, from 5% Gothic to 100% Gothic. But there's some problems as well, and I didn't want to just give you all the good news. I'm going to give you some bad news as well. So here we have Orderic Vitalis analyzed in the manner that I've introduced you to in the database, and I've measured 2 of his dated manuscripts. One is dated 1109-10, datable, and the other one datable to 1141. So there's a good 30 years in between. And you would think, okay, Gothic becomes really important in this time period. Orderic is actually doing a lot of new things. So that's what I thought I would see, and I've done this with a few other manuscripts as well, of other scribes, but that's not the case. So if you look at those numbers, all it is a percentage of, again, the Gothicness, the maximum Gothicness of what you could do. So that is, all the features that we call Gothic are 100%. How many of those features are present in the writing of this particular individual in 1109-10? That is 43%. And how much in 1141? That is 43%. He doesn't write differently from how he was trained. So Orderic was trained in the 1090s, and he keeps on writing exactly, this data suggests, in the way he was trained. But that's not what we want to hear if we want to explain how a script becomes more important, how it becomes more Gothic. Because if Orderic is passing on almost exactly to his pupil how he is writing, then the pupil will write in the manner of 1090. So if Orderic were to train somebody in 1130, and he trains him in the way he was taught to write in 1090, that means that the 1130 way of writing is the same as 1090. That's not progress. So that doesn't really help. So I didn't want to leave you with only positive news. There is problems as well. There's another enigma to solve. But when I thought about this for the past few days, it also made me realize that it depends on writing masters in a monastery who do things differently, but also who do things the same. That might actually explain this warning, strange graph that you've seen before. Maybe this is why the lines are not going up evenly. Maybe writing masters introduce new features that are passed on to pupils and ultimately will travel to other monasteries, whereby a certain feature will gain prominence and will stick and become part of the new script. Whereas other writing masters are not introducing more conservatively in their writing, will not introduce new features, but there's still a whole generation of scribes that they train, and therefore a certain feature will not be introduced and therefore will be tempered in how fast it goes up. So I think that might be an explanation of why this particular feature is seen sort of so wobbly across this particular graph. And it's also made me think about the enigma, the real enigma of medieval script is perhaps not so much how it changes and how we can measure it, and how there's different meanings in letters, not just the words that we read, but also information related to time and space. But it's also the moments when lines stop to go up and down. What I haven't shown you here is where it goes to, textualis. And then everybody, that's the third script in the 3 that I showed you, everybody in Europe writes exactly the same way. So out of this complete mess that you see here comes one script, one way of writing, meaning all writing masters across Europe promote a script in the same fashion, have a norm that must be the same throughout all countries and all different monastic orders, and even beyond the monastic world. Because it is in the Litera Textualis that we see no difference, or hardly any difference. And that, I think, is the true enigma of medieval script. It's not just about how a script searches and finds a certain form. The real enigma to me is that at a certain point, scribes across Europe and the writing masters say, and now it's enough. No more changes. This is the way we write. Thank you.
Fantastic. Right, thank you very much indeed, Eric. That was fascinating. I was just thinking about how we write, and whether we write handwriting, whether it's letters or essays today, we're not usually thinking about anything more than the message or the structure of what we're writing, and really whether it's legible or not. We're not thinking at all. We may be leaving hidden clues, and I guess we almost all just throw away all the notes and the jottings. That's not kept at all. But actually, much of what we write isn't kept either. Pen and ink are cheap and easily thrown away, so I'm not sure what this is going to look like in the future. Just looking at listening to what you said, it just seems like the changing shapes of the letter forms and the scripts through time just looks a bit like evolution of a virus, perhaps. But it gets to one point and stays there. As you say, how, why, that doesn't happen in nature. So next week, we turn to the sort of many aspects and sometimes violent consequences of volcanic processes. Professor Tamsin Mather from the Department of Earth Sciences in Oxford is coming to speak on eruptions, emissions, and enigmas, from fuming volcanic vents to mass extinction events. Should be interesting. We hope to see you here then. But finally, before we go, let's just thank Eric Coquelle again very much indeed for coming to Cambridge tonight.